Welcome to our Future Transactions podcast, brought to you by Forces Children Scotland, thanks to funding from the Scottish Veterans Fund. Future Transactions is about supporting families to get prepared financially for when the time comes to leave the armed forces and make the change to civilian life. For children and young people, we know that making the change from military to civilian life for their parents can prove very challenging in lots of different ways, and money can prove just one of those things. And that's why our podcast is here, to help children and young people to learn more about how to make things easier when it comes to keeping pennies in the bank and much more. So today I'm delighted to say we're joined by Christina from the charity Fast Forward, and we're going to learn a little bit more about gambling. We're going to learn about the gambling industry, and we're also going to basically look at aspects of gambling when things can maybe lead to significant challenges to pennies and many other things that are really important to children and young people, Christina. So I'm thinking I'd like to start this podcast by maybe looking at a couple of stats that you shared with me. So you told me that basically 50% of 11 to 16-year-olds in the research that you've been involved in have participated in gambling, whether that be legal or illegal. And also children and young adults are much more likely to experience gambling harm than adults. So I think that's a really interesting point to start on, Christina. So can you just tell us a little bit more about the gambling industry and how it relates to children and young people?
Sure. So we know that children and young people are living an increasing proportion of their lives online. And that brings with it all sorts of benefits. For example, around online gaming, we know that that can boost social skills and build empathy. It can also boost numeracy and literacy. But we also know that there are potentially harms associated with some of these online kind of engagements, whether that's from around online gaming or gambling or exposure to harmful content on social media. Gambling itself is a common risk-taking behavior among young people in Scotland, and as you say, half of 11 to 16-year-olds have participated in gambling in the last year. That might be picking lottery numbers for a family member or friend, or it might be spending money, their own money on gambling. That means that it's more common than either vaping or using substances such as alcohol or illicit drugs or cigarettes. And that can be surprising for parents and people who work with children and young people, because gambling is something that you don't necessarily see a lot of. But what we talk about is that gambling can be quite hidden. So while you can see whether somebody's been using substances through cues like scents or paraphernalia associated with substances, gambling can be quite hidden. You might be gambling on your phone in the middle of the day and nobody would know the difference. So some of the forms of gambling that are included in that 50% also are forms that aren't age restricted. So such as penny pushers at the arcade, or picking lottery numbers, or placing a bet on a card game between friends and family. Something we're seeing more and more among children and young people is a link between online gaming and gambling through gambling-like features. One of these is loot boxes. So a loot box is an in-game item that you can purchase that contains randomized rewards. So that might be things like equipment to make your character stronger or faster, a faster car. It might be experience points or power-ups, or it might just be something that looks cool, that makes your character look a certain way. And 2 in 5 young people used a loot box in the last year. What connects these with gambling is the fact that you don't know what you're going to be getting. So game developers might advertise that a loot box potentially contains some particular really rare, desirable reward, which then motivates people to spend and spend and spend to try to get that. And they may not disclose the odds of getting it, or they may disclose those in a way that makes it difficult to understand. And we know that young people who spend heavily on loot boxes are also more likely to be experiencing harm from their gambling.
Would you say as well that with regards to that kind of behavioural psychology, algorithms and AI now, that's quite a potential danger for things maybe spiralling out from sort of safe gambling into gambling harm for children and young people?
Absolutely. So something that we see a lot is that ad exposure for children and young people is massive, despite the fact that gambling ads are age restricted. So almost half of young people saw gambling ads or see gambling ads once a week on their social media or video streaming feeds. And we also know that ads on social media appear, they appeal to children and young people more than they appeal to older adults. And that's concerning because they're not meant to be appealing to children and young people. Because of these kinds of influences, so advertising and kind of features that are gambling-like in games, young people can see gambling as something that's fun to take part in, and that's the most common reason that young people say they would gamble. It's also something that you might be exposed to through family members, whether that's attending a sports match and helping choose bets, or picking lottery numbers. And 3 in 10 young people see their family members gamble in the home. And we know that those 3 in 10 young people are then more likely to also gamble themselves.
Sure.
Young people can also be exposed to gambling through peers, like friends, whether that's at school, online, or engagement with sport. For football fans, they were bombarded with 11,000 gambling ads in the opening weekend of the most recent Premier League.
Wow.
Alone. So this can be a massive influence that's super subtle, but it's absolutely everywhere.
Because I think that's a really interesting point. You mentioned the word influence, and it was really interesting when you talked about vaping, which, when you consider that's another risk-taking behaviour, but that's across all the media now, and I think particularly too with influencers. And influencers have played such a huge role in promoting vaping to young people. They shouldn't be doing it, but they're doing it. And they're doing it at increasingly concerning numbers. And the same here with potential illegal gambling, basically to legal gambling. So are you finding in your research that maybe are influencers playing a role in terms of encouraging children and young people to gamble?
Absolutely. It's and it's not always the influencers that you would expect as well. So something that we often use in our sessions is a video of a young boy who, I won't remember how old he was, but I think he was about 9 or younger, opening loot boxes, and the kind of reactions that he's having to, oh yeah, I got this, whatever the item is, being so engaging that he gets massive views, and then that makes opening loot boxes seem like in itself an activity and seem really fun and engaging. So I think that's an area where legislation struggles to kind of keep up. So noticing that the impact of having influencers even speaking about gambling-related products can have a massive effect. It takes that bit of time to then start intervening with legislation. So that's definitely an area of concern.
No, it's like I say, it's all very, very useful, insightful information, Christina, absolutely. So moving on to topic 2, we're going to look at now sort of gambling in the context of children and young people from the armed forces community. So within the research, Christina, is there anything to indicate that gambling can be used as potentially a coping mechanism for many unique challenges faced, whether you're being in an armed forces or a veteran family?
Absolutely. So we know that experience of gambling harm is more common in the armed forces community than the general population. One potential kind of life stage that's an inflection point for young people is transition stages, where they might be moving to a new school or into training or work or into recruitment. And at these kinds of transition points, there can be a fair bit of stress associated with change. And if you're using gambling as a coping mechanism, that can escalate the risk of harm really quickly. We also know that just in terms of participation, it's a lot more common among people in the armed forces, which means that exposure for young people is going to be increased if family members or friends are taking part. And that means that they themselves are more likely to take part. Unfortunately, we also know that because experience of harm is higher in the armed forces community, young people whose parents or caregivers have experienced harmful gambling are more likely to then themselves go on and experience it. And even among the general population, 2 million children and young people are living in the same home with a parent or caregiver who's going through harmful gambling, which is massive. And if it's more likely in the armed forces community, that means that even if your particular family isn't going through it, it's something to really keep an eye on in terms of friends or people that you might know, because it's out there.
And it's really interesting there, like you say, in terms of the coping mechanisms, particularly with the unique challenges faces, because I think in my experience working with many children and young people from the armed forces community, that particularly with something like mobility, many of these children and young people in armed forces families, they will move regularly, maybe every two years or so. So I think for me, there's every story is very unique and there's little individual nuances, but it comes down to, in my sort of my understanding, that many will face unique challenges with education, sometimes challenging curriculums, different exam structures, and sometimes they might be able to do the subjects they did before. But equally too, the integration with the community, and that can lead to isolation and loneliness. So I can imagine all these factors are in many ways quite high risk factors potentially. With you consider too that when you see gambling so prevalent in their social feeds, that this could be quite an encouraging way of escapism.
Absolutely, particularly given the kinds of messages that they might be receiving around gambling being fun, gambling being a way to relax, to relieve stress, or it can also seem quite social in the sense that often ads show big groups of people all having fun together, and it's something that can be quite seductive if, as you say, you're going through a stage where you're feeling isolated, you're feeling lonely, you don't have a lot of social support. So that's one of the things that makes these transition periods such a vulnerable time.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really great point to move on to the next topic, Christina. So, there may be children and young people listening to this. We've just covered, some of the, a very brief coverage of those unique challenges faced, but they may be thinking, okay, this sounds a little bit like some of my lived experience, and some of them may have already experienced gambling. So can you give us a little bit of information, insight about what harmful gambling might look like to a child or a young person?
Sure. So one of the kinds of questions that you might be able to ask yourself is whether you've experienced any negative effects, whether you've experienced being secretive or lying to people close to you, or even at a lower level, something like losing sleep, worrying about it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be worrying about your own gambling. It might be worrying about the gambling of somebody close to you. In Scotland, we know that 200,000 people are experiencing or at risk of experiencing harm from their gambling. And young people and people from the armed forces community are at higher risk. We also know that one for every one person who's experiencing harmful gambling, 6 people close to them are likely to be affected. And often the harms that those people experience are very similar to those experienced by the person gambling, but they're from a different perspective. So when we talk about harm from gambling, we tend to talk about it in terms of 3 kind of categories: resources, relationships, and health. For resources, the most obvious ones tend to be around kind of finances and debt. For young people, that might look more like not having enough money to pay for things that you need, to kind of cover, say, bus fare. But it can also be connected to lateness or absenteeism at school or work or in a training. And it can play into poor performance or kind of lack of progression. It can mean that you don't get opportunities or you don't get kind of chances to advance. And it can lead to experience of unemployment and homelessness. Within relationships, gambling can mean that it can lead to more tension in the home, it can lead to arguments, and ultimately to relationship breakdown. And that can often be, particularly for young people, that can often be connected to homelessness. Around health, we know that it's connected to both physical and mental health. Around physical health, that often looks like losing sleep or not taking care of yourself in the way that you would ordinarily do.
Sure.
If that's not eating properly or exercising or doing the things that you would usually do to take care of your well-being. Around mental health, it's connected to things that could be as low level as I've said, just worrying about it, feeling a bit more anxious. It can also be linked to things further down the line, such as experience of anxiety, depression, and ultimately suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And I just emphasize that for young people, even the kinds of small impacts can then ripple out and have a bigger impact on their lives, because if you're in a stage of transition where you're looking to new opportunities, that can shut down new opportunities for you if your kind of performance is affected.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point there to continue on. So I think we're going to look now at the gambling behaviour continuum, Christina, and I think what we're going to do whilst this podcast is running, I think we're actually going to bring that graphic up now so children and young people can see what we're going to talk about. So I thought it'd be really interesting for you to talk about that. Equally, given that our audience is potentially children and young people from armed forces and veteran families, just for them to think about some scenarios. So for example, there could be someone listening here thinking, okay, I've got a parent currently deployed, or okay, I've just recently moved to a new school, or I have just made the change from military to civilian life with my family. So these are all major transitional points that you described. And I think that would be a really useful thing for children and young people to think about in their heads, about something that's a major transition in their life and how this might relate to the gambling behaviour continuum that's now up on the screen.
Sure. So something we're keen to emphasize is that all gambling carries a risk of harm, but we know that some kinds of behavior patterns are connected to higher risk of harm. So at one end of the scale, we'd have something where a person's gambling occasionally, recreationally. They're expecting to lose, but hoping to win. And moving kind of into at-risk category, we might see people starting to feel guilty about spending more than they intended to, or even spending more time than they'd intended to. So starting to see a bit of impairment around control. And then at the more severe end, experience of harmful or disordered gambling. That's where there's impairment of control over gambling and impacts on resources, relationships, and health, like we've described.
And that's what we're saying. I think when a child or a young person is maybe experiencing a real significant transition, it can potentially go from that safer end of the scale to the more dangerous side of the scale. That's kind of what we're saying there.
Yeah, even people experiencing harm tend to move between these categories over time. For example, if you're going through a period of transition, or if you're engaging with different products than you have in the past, that might that might shift your behavior to one category or another. And I'd also emphasize that for people in the at-risk and harmful categories, they make up 5% of people who gamble, but they represent 60% of industry profits. So a disproportionate amount of profit comes from people at risk or experiencing harm.
Absolutely. So I think that wraps up our particular podcast there, Christina. So I really want to thank you for sharing all that valuable information and insight. And I really hope children and young people listening to this really take some insight into this. And we certainly hope that you found this particularly useful. And if you want to know anything else about gambling harm and how it can affect resources, relationships on your physical and mental health, please visit Forces Children Scotland's website and search future transactions. And like I say, thank you for listening.